The RMS Olympic was the sister ship to the Titanic, and even tried to help rescue survivors during the infamous sinking. But fate eventually came for the Olympic as well, and when it did, it was absolutely devastating. But more on this later. For the first few years of its life, the RMS Olympic was the world's largest ocean liner. For a brief period, the Titanic was larger, but we all know what happened there. After the Titanic sank, the Olympic gained its old title back until 1913, when Germany's SS Imperator was launched. But though it only had a brief tenure as the largest ocean liner, it had a long and storied career. In the first years of the 20th century, the White Star Line faced increasing competition, primarily from Cunard, the British shipping and cruise line, which had just introduced two incredibly fast passenger ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. That was when White Star Line's chairman came up with the plan to go head-to-head with them, and win. Cunard's ships were known for their speed, and if the White Star Line couldn't compete with them on that, they'd have to be better in other ways. They wanted their ships to be bigger and more luxurious to appeal to customers who wanted a comfortable, palatial experience on the water as they traveled. White Star Lines collaborated with longtime partners Harland and Wolff, an Irish shipbuilding company. When it came to building the Olympic, money was no object. White Star said, "How much do you need?" And Harland and Wolff came back with a figure of £3 million for the first two ships, plus extras as needed and their usual 5% fee. When the contracts were signed, the boat was as yet unnamed, so it was nicknamed Number 400, to reflect the fact that it was the 400th hull that Harland and Wolff had produced. They then revised the design slightly to begin building its even bigger sister ship, the Titanic. Harland and Wolff expanded their headquarters, and 3 months after they started building the Olympic, they started to work on the Titanic as well. They didn't know it then, but the fates of these two ships would forever be tied together. In many, if not most aspects, the Olympic and the Titanic were twins, if different in size. They had the same number of lifeboats and lifeboat setup, the same passenger facilities, fittings, deck designs, and technical specs. Even a grand staircase nearly identical to that of the Titanic. When it came to the experience that the Olympic offered first-class passengers, the White Star Line truly spared no expense. Aside from the grand staircase, there were stately cabins, some of which even had private bathrooms, a large dining hall, and a smaller restaurant. On top of that, there was a smoking room, the Veranda Cafe, which was decorated with palm trees, a pool, a Turkish bath, a gym, and several other places where guests could eat or socialize. Second-class passengers had a fair amount of amenities to themselves as well, including a smoking room, a library, a large dining hall, and an elevator. Also on board was the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, and a team of engineers from Harland and Wolff, there to address problems and opportunities for redesign on the fly. Finally, at the helm was Edward Smith, a name familiar to many as the same man who captained the Titanic. Unsurprisingly, the largest ship in the world, the Olympic, got a lot of press on its maiden voyage. It was greeted in New York City by scores of visitors, and when it was open to the public, some 8,000 people explored its corridors and decks, with 10,000 gathering to watch it make its return to England. A trip nearly double in size, with 2,301 passengers. The Olympic had been on a scant 4 journeys when, on its 5th, it ran into its first big disaster. On September 20, 1911, the Olympic collided with a British warship, the HMS Hawke, on a strait that runs between the Isle of Wight and Great Britain. The ships were sailing parallel to each other when the Olympic went to turn starboard, resulting in the nose of the Hawke, which was outfitted to ram other ships, hitting the side of the Olympic. It left massive holes above and below the waterline of the Olympic, though the ship was still able to sail to safety in Southampton. But the Hawke wasn't so lucky. In photos, the severity of the damage to the Hawke against the damage to the Olympic is quite notable. The ship almost capsized in the incident, but in an incredible twist of fate, there were no serious injuries or deaths that resulted from the collision. Both ships, in the end, were repaired, but there were serious consequences to it all. In the aftermath of the incident, White Star Lines not only had to cover extensive legal bills, it also had to pull resources from the construction of the Titanic to quickly repair the Olympic and make it ocean-ready again and profitable again. Parts had to be pulled off the Titanic and used in the repairs of the Olympic, pushing back the Titanic's maiden voyage by weeks. There was one unforeseen side effect of the whole collision though. Instead of damaging White Star Line's reputation, the fact that the Olympic survived the whole accident relatively unscathed left an impression on people. One that the line's Olympic class of ships might just be unsinkable. Then came the infamous tragedy. Just after midnight on April 15, 1912, the Titanic sent out its first distress call. A wireless operator aboard the Olympic heard the call and immediately alerted Captain Haddock, who changed the Olympic's course to head to its sister ship. It had just over 500 miles to cross. The Olympic had made it most of the way when they received a call from White Star Line's major competition, Cunard's RMS Carpathia. The ship's captain said that it was too late for them to offer any help, and that the Carpathia had accounted for every lifeboat, saving 675 people. Among those who perished were the Olympic's one-time captain, Edward Smith, and the man who designed both the Olympic and the Titanic, Thomas Andrews. Still, the Olympic wanted to help, so they contacted the Carpathia, offering to help transport survivors. However, that's when bureaucracy got in the way. The chairman of the White Star Line told the captain of the Carpathia to refuse the offer. He thought that bringing survivors on board a nearly identical boat would be frightening. With that, the Olympic continued its voyage back to Southampton, likely a tense and upsetting 6 days for the passengers on board. Though the Olympic hadn't been able to help the Titanic directly, it played a major role during the inquiry into the latter ship's sinking that followed. As they were nearly identical, the Olympic was used by investigators and thoroughly examined, a process which included sea trials to gauge both ships' turning speeds. However, these very similarities were about to present a new set of problems for White Star Line and the Olympic. When the Titanic went down, over 1,500 people perished, including approximately 688 crew members. This was in part due to the fact that there were more people on board than there were lifeboats. And as both ships had nearly identical lifeboat setups, the crew of the Olympic became thoroughly aware of these problems as the news of the Titanic broke and outlets began to report on the discrepancy. The Olympic had immediately been outfitted with collapsible lifeboats when it returned to Southampton, after its attempted rescue of the Titanic. But a number of the crew didn't trust their seaworthiness. In late April 1912, 284 of the Olympic's firemen went on strike, and they had a good reason too. Upon examining the lifeboats, which had been transferred from troop ships, crew members made a disturbing discovery. Many had rotted to the point where they wouldn't open up. They asked for wooden lifeboats, but White Star Line refused. They even claimed the collapsible boats had passed inspection. Sobered by the massive loss of life from the Titanic, many of the Olympic's crew weren't willing to put their lives on the line for the job. With the departure impending, the White Star Line scrambled to bring on scabs, hiring 100 workers locally and going as far as Liverpool to find more. At the same time, a group of the striking stokers attended a test of 4 of the collapsible lifeboats. One was found to be faulty, and those present said they would recommend a return to work if it was replaced. There was just one problem. The focus shifted from the faulty lifeboats to the non-union scabs that White Star Line had brought on to stick to their departure date. Union laborers on the ship claimed that the scabs were unqualified and therefore dangerous to work with. They asked White Star Line to dismiss them. It was a request that the company refused. When the 54 sailors who walked off the Olympic arrived on shore, they were greeted by waiting authorities eager to detain them on charges of mutiny. 10 days later, officials in Portsmouth found that the charges were valid, but refused to imprison or fine the 54 sailors due to the unusual circumstances. The White Star Line knew that they had a PR nightmare on their hands, so they quietly let the sailors return to work and planned their next steps to restore their name. Less than 6 months after the sinking of the Titanic, White Star Lines brought its sister ship, the Olympic, back to its birthplace, the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. They wanted to solve the problems they'd uncovered in the Titanic investigation and in the Olympic's previous 6 months of service, and improve safety measures. After the workers' strike of 1912, they knew exactly where to start. Harland and Wolff upped the number of lifeboats on the Olympic from 20 to 68, with supports for them to match. In the boiler and engine rooms, an extra watertight layer was added, essentially making it a double hull. Among many other improvements, more watertight bulkheads were added. On the Titanic, they had only gone up a short distance higher than the waterline, which had been one of the fatal flaws. All these extra measures meant that the Olympic was guaranteed to survive in the same circumstances that had sunk the Titanic. Harland and Wolff didn't just take care of safety measures during their upgrade of the Olympic. They also gave it a facelift, adding more perks for first-class passengers, including more private bathrooms and more dining options. Ads from the White Star Line lauded the new Olympic and endorsed its new safety features in the wake of the sinking of the Titanic. Aside from a bad storm that resulted in some broken windows, it enjoyed a relatively peaceful stint as a passenger ship throughout 1913 and part of 1914. But disaster was once again lurking on the horizon. When Britain joined World War I, the Olympic remained a passenger ship. The White Star Line had to take measures to camouflage it from German forces. These efforts included painting the ship gray, covering portholes, and keeping lights low or off. The memory of the Titanic had quickly faded from view, but the threat from German U-boats had grown exponentially. White Star Lines prepared to close up shop and take the Olympic out of commercial service temporarily. However, on its final voyage, it ran into trouble. On October 27, 1914, the Olympic received a distress call from the HMS Audacious. The battleship had hit a mine and was taking on water near Tory Island in Ireland. Finally, they had a chance to help where they hadn't been able to during the Titanic disaster. 250 of the Audacious crew took shelter on board the Olympic, as 2 other nearby ships struggled to save the battleship. Sadly, their efforts were futile. As it became clear the ship was going to go under, the rest of the crew evacuated to the Olympic and another waiting ship. It was a massive loss for Great Britain and the Allies, and the Olympic was caught in the middle. The passengers were held on board and communications were stopped. They were now at the mercy of Jellicoe's plan to keep the sinking of the Audacious secret. After the final commercial voyage, White Star Lines planned to have the Olympic return to Belfast to wait out the war. In the same shipyard, the Britannic, its other sister ship, was waiting for the war to end so it could be completed and take its maiden voyage. Of course though, this was a war, a fierce one, and England had a shortage of ships. The Olympic size was both a source of strength and a disadvantage during wartime, and for a while she was deemed unsuitable to participate in more decisive missions. She spent several months transporting troops in battle camouflage, going between Great Britain and Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. However, the Olympic still had one big battle in her. When the US joined World War I, the Olympic began transporting American troops as well. It was on one of these voyages in May of 1918 that the crew of the Olympic spotted U-103, a German U-boat. They opened fire immediately and also rammed the craft, causing it to sink. They did all this knowing they were in danger, but not knowing how dire it was. Later, it was discovered that U-103 had been about to fire on Olympic, but hadn't been able to flood two of the torpedo tubes in time. The Olympic had saved itself and the men it was carrying with just seconds to spare. Its wartime captain, Bertram Fox Hayes, was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, a great honor, and some of the American troops on board also created a plaque for the ship to show their gratitude. It was the only passenger liner to both ram and sink a German U-boat in World War I. Thanks to its prolonged, prolific service in World War I, carrying some 201,000 men over 184 miles over those years, the Olympic was given the name Old Reliable. Sadly, that reputation could not be shared with its other sister ship, the Britannic, which hit a naval mine and sank in Greece in 1916. It was the largest ship lost in World War I. After that, the Olympic was the only surviving Olympic-class ship in the White Star Line. Following the end of World War I, the Olympic once again returned to dry dock in Belfast to be retrofitted to become a passenger liner again. In 1921, the Olympic smashed its previous records for passengers, transporting 38,000 people. It was the best year of the ship's career. Throughout the decade, the ship was a popular choice for the rich and famous, and notable passengers include Mary Keady, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and the future Edward VIII, then Prince of Wales. Changing immigration laws in the US reduced the demand for transatlantic travel, at least in the third class. Though White Star tried to shift with the currents, making improvements and doing their best to attract travelers, there was one factor that they simply couldn't fight: the Great Depression. White Star Lines found it hard to keep the Olympic moving and profitable in the wake of the Great Depression. Passengers were dwindling and efforts to upgrade the boat were met with apathy. In 1933 and 1934, the Olympic operated at a net loss for the very first time. Then, in 1934, disaster struck yet again. In May of 1934, the Olympic failed to make a turn and accidentally sliced through the Nantucket lightship LV-117. The smaller boat sank nearly immediately. Though the Olympic acted fast to lower lifeboats to survivors, there were 7 casualties out of 11 crew. Soon after, White Star Lines and Cunard merged in order to finance the building of 2 new liners to take over express service. With the completion of the ships, the Olympic was basically made redundant. Cunard White Star retired the Olympic in 1935. Though a few potential buyers showed interest, only one came through: a member of parliament who bought it so its demolition could be a literal make-work project for a depressed town in England. It was a sad and undignified end for the craft that had survived so much and earned the nickname Old Reliable in battle. As the ship's former engineer said, "I could understand the necessity if the old lady had lost her efficiency, but the engines are as sound as they ever were." Over the years, the Olympic had transported 430,000 passengers over 1.8 million miles, competing 257 round trips across the Atlantic Ocean. But there's also an even darker side to its remarkable career. Unlike its sister ships, the Titanic and the Britannic, the Olympic did not sink. However, if the Olympic hadn't collided with the HMS Hawke in 1911, pushing back the completion of the Titanic, things might have been different. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.